Welcome, everyone, to week 3 of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Today, we are going to be talking about Dickinson and religion, really Dickinson and Christianity, which was her religious context. But before we get into that, I'm going to share a little bit with you about how to scan poetry. What that means, you will find out in just a minute. All right, so today's thematic guiding questions are: how does Dickinson deal with religious questions in her poetry? What are her attitudes towards religious belief? Now, we have to remember coming into this, as I've said the past couple of weeks, that we can't always interpret the speaker of a poem, the words in the poem, as what Dickinson herself believes. Remember, she's really clear from the start that she is not always representing her own thoughts or her own beliefs. She's using personae. So just keep that in mind. But we'll talk a little bit about her religious context, her attitudes towards Christianity, so far as we can tell from the literary and letter writing record. But last week in our class meeting, somebody mentioned that there's a TikTok or YouTube trend of singing Emily Dickinson poems to the tune of the Pokemon theme song. I hadn't heard of this before, so I looked it up. You can go to this video. Hopefully, we can link it in the description box to this video. If not, you can type in that tiny URL. And here's someone doing this. It totally works. And there actually is a poetic explanation for why. So we have to start at the very beginning to figure this out with syllables. So syllables are the building blocks of words. Words have a certain number of syllables. You might remember in school clapping with a word to figure out how many syllables it has. Some syllables are stressed and other syllables are unstressed in the way that we pronounce words. So, for example, poem, we put the stress, the emphasis on the first syllable in that two-syllable word. Belief, which is also a two-syllable word, has the stress on the second syllable. My own name, Abigail, which is 3 syllables, has a stress on the final syllable. Dickinson, on the other hand, which is also 3 syllables, all the syllables receive a similar level of stress. So I've labeled them as unstressed syllables, Dickinson, right? Our voice isn't really emphasizing one over the other. You may have heard this in an English class as accented or unaccented syllables. That is the same thing. So understanding that words and the way that we pronounce words put stresses on different syllables, we can then think about meter. So meter is the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. And these make up rhythmic components of a poem known as poetic feet. There are at least 2 syllables in each of these rhythmic units, these poetic feet. And they all have names. I'm not getting into them here, but you may have heard of iambs or trochees or anapaests. Those are all poetic feet, and each one has a certain internal logic for how the stresses and lack of stresses operate. So in an iamb, it's a 2-syllable foot, and the first syllable is unstressed, the second syllable is stressed. Iambs are all over English poetry, and Dickinson uses a lot. The process of identifying a poem's meter is called scanning. There's that word, or the noun form scansion. So often poetry will have, or often a poem will have a dominant meter and also a dominant rhyme scheme if it's a rhymed poem. But not every line will be perfect. Sometimes a line that doesn't quite fit the dominant meter is a cue to us as readers to pay special attention to the word or the phrase that disrupts that metrical pattern, that internal rhythm to the poem. Likewise, a poem with a dominant rhyme scheme that I'm realizing I didn't finish this bullet point, that has a line that doesn't rhyme or is a slant rhyme that is just barely rhymes, might be calling our attention to that word or phrase that's marked by the different rhyme. So let's look at an example, and that might help us begin to understand how meter operates in poetry. And actually, the connection that I want to draw out is one of Dickinson's religious context. So there are a variety of different meters that have specific names. Common meter is, as you might guess, a common metrical pattern in English poetry. And it's a meter used in many Christian hymns, especially ones that Dickinson would have encountered as she was growing up going to church. So common meter are typically 4-line stanzas, alternating lines of 8 syllables with 4 stresses and 6 syllables with 3 stresses. What does that mean? Let's look at an example. This is from probably one of the most famous hymns that is written in common meter. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. You can hear that rhythm even without trying to impose it on the stanza here. But here it is with the stressed syllables in bold. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. There's that big emphasis that saved a wretch like me. And this poem also has a typical rhyme scheme for common meter. We mark rhyme scheme by letters. So we have sound and found that rhyme, me and see rhyme, and we mark those similar rhymes, or those rhymes, with letters. So rhyme A, rhyme B. So we would say that this is a 4-line stanza with rhyme scheme A, B, A, B. Let's look at the start of one of the poems that we read for today. So I'll invite you, if you're able to pause the video and read this out loud so you can feel the rhythm as well. If you're not able to, though, that's okay. I will, of course, read it out loud as well. But again, it's always helpful to hear poems multiple times and in multiple voices. My faith is larger than the hills, so when the hills decay, my faith must take the purple wheel to show the sun the way. Do you hear that already? My faith is larger than the hills. So when the hills decay, there's that emphasis. 4 syllables in the first line, 3 syllables in the second. And it's following the same pattern as the hymn that we looked at. Now you'll notice that the rhyme scheme is slightly different. The first and the third line don't rhyme here. So we would mark this as A, B, C, B. And what we would do is, looking at this whole poem, see if other stanzas follow that same pattern of second and fourth lines rhyming, but first and third not. And if there's any inconsistencies, that would be a place where we'd want to pay attention. Just as if we're reading this whole poem and there's a place where this rhythm is suddenly different, that's a place where we would want to pay attention as well. And as you might guess, this is the same metrical pattern, these patterns of stresses and unstressed syllables that the Pokemon theme song uses. So that's how you can sing Emily Dickinson's poems to the tune of the Pokemon theme song, because the Pokemon theme song is written in common meter. So just a fun little connection to a contemporary thing going on the internet, but also Dickinson's own poetic and especially religious context in which this metrical pattern was everywhere. So let's look at one of her other poems and talk a little bit about how this meter and the content work together. The form and the content work together. As always, feel free to pause and read out loud. Papa above, regard a mouse or powered by the cat. Reserve within thy kingdom a mansion for the rat. Snug in seraphic cupboards to nibble all the day, while unsuspecting cycles wheel solemnly away. You can feel that rhythm, right? And in the second stanza, we have a perfect example of a 4-line common meter. We have that ABCB rhyme that we saw in the previous poem that Dickinson uses a lot. But in this first stanza, we have 5 lines. So that's a little bit unusual because of the rhythm of the poem. We might expect 4. Papa above, regard a mouse or powered by the cat. Papa above and regard a mouse, these first 2 lines, together make a complete first common meter line, what we might expect to see in a hymn. So Dickinson chooses to separate them and separates them with an exclamation point. Papa above, this petition to God, but through very familiar language. Papa above, like a child talking to their father. As we saw last week, metaphors can mean more than one thing. And here we have this image of a mouse being chased by a cat, a rat being given a mansion in heaven. And we might consider how mice and rats and cats could be used literally. Maybe Dickinson is asking for God to remember the importance of these small, insignificant creations. Or we might consider how these are metaphors for maybe the experience of being human. A mouse or powered by a cat. Maybe the mouse is humanity, a cat or a specific human, the speaker. A cat could be a representation of evil or an enemy, right? So we have these different layers that we can think about in the metaphors of the poem. Reserve within thy kingdom a mansion for the rat. Dickinson, by putting mansion in quotation marks, is referencing a biblical passage in the book of Matthew when Jesus, God's son, says, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." And he says that he goes to prepare mansions for his followers. So this rat, the speaker hopes, will also have one of those mansions. Snug in seraphic cupboards to nibble all the day, while unsuspecting cycles wheel solemnly away. So we might picture the rat in its heavenly mansion, nibbling the food in the cupboard. So maybe it's not its own mansion, but it lives in somebody else's mansion like it would on Earth. The final 2 lines, while unsuspecting cycles wheel solemnly away, suggests a continuation, a cyclicality, seasons changing, life cycles that the rat is now removed from. So thinking of that metaphorically, we might wonder what it means for a mouse or a rat to have a mansion in heaven and for cycles to continue to wheel solemnly away on earth. What does that separation mean? That's just one way to think about it. See if there are other ways that you can use the text to understand what might be going on here. And in the next section of this brief lecture, I'll give you some context for how Dickinson thinks theologically, or I should say how Dickinson's context thinks theologically about life on earth, in heaven, and these themes that this poem starts to tease out, not only through its content, but by alluding to the hymn through its use of common meter. And hymns are Christian songs of praise. Okay, so Dickinson was raised in a Christian family, particularly a Calvinist family, attended a congregational church until 1868 when she stopped attending. And in the 19th century, pretty much everybody, especially in a small New England town, attended church. So her poetry suggests that even though she stopped attending church in 1868 and was unwilling to publicly confess her faith, a feature of New England Calvinism even earlier in her life, she still read the Bible. She still engaged with Christian theology, thinking about God, and she still read Christian writers. So while there are signs that might suggest Dickinson rejected her faith in the way that she lived her life, her poetry might make us question that. It's helpful to understand a little bit about what Calvinism is, and particularly its New England expression, because Dickinson uses the language of this theological system throughout her poetry. So Calvinism is a theological system based on the work of Protestant reformer John Calvin, who lived in the 16th century. It was brought to Massachusetts by English Puritans, from whom Dickinson is descended, and it fluctuated in popularity as a way of thinking about God, about how the world, the natural world, humanity, and God existed together, what their relationship was, for centuries. The Dickinson family, however, were always strong supporters of Calvinist doctrine, whether or not it was kind of in fashion in New England. In the 19th century, especially the mid-19th century, a variety of Christian expressions were beginning to appear in New England in particular. And so Dickinson's family kind of dug their heels in as stalwart defenders of a New England Calvinism. I keep saying New England Calvinism because this is still a theological system that many folks, many Christians subscribe to today. So I'm talking about a particular historical, contextualized way of thinking about this that might not be reflective of the way that people practice or think about Calvinism today. So just kind of hear this with that caveat. So here's just a brief overview of how this view of Christian belief was understood. So before the world was even created, God predestined some people to heaven. So those people who are predestined are called the elect. They're also sometimes called saints. We'll see Dickinson use both of these terms. Saints in this context, because Calvinists are Protestant, does not mean like a Roman Catholic saint. It just means all believers, all of the elect. So the fall in Eden, which we talked about last week, corrupted all of humanity with sin, so that each human is totally depraved, unable to do anything good without God's help. Salvation, which is provided through the death and resurrection of Jesus, is a gift of God's grace. Jesus is God's Son, and they're both part of the Trinity. And individuals can do nothing to affect their own salvation because they're predestined from before they were even born. But while Calvinism teaches predestination, Calvinist faithful also seek to identify a conversion moment in which they can point to experiencing the effects of salvation provided by what's termed irresistible grace. Once God has called you to be saved, you can't do anything to escape it. It's irresistible because you've been predestined. So identifying this moment of conversion and being able to articulate it, especially publicly, was an important feature of early New England Calvinism in the 17th century. And when Dickinson was unwilling to publicly confess her faith at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary when she was young, she was responding to this long tradition of providing evidence for salvation that Calvinists really emphasize as an important feature of Christian community. So, following life on earth, the elect will be united with God in heaven through the second coming of Jesus. Jesus will come back to earth and resurrect all of the saints, the elect, and bring them to heaven with him. So, all of these terms that I've put in bold, I've bolded because they're phrases or themes that Dickinson is really interested in her poetry. Resurrection, election are phrases that come up again and again. And this idea of predestination is something that she really struggles with and really works to think through in her poetry. So, as I said, we don't really know where Dickinson landed on Christianity, but we can see in her poetry that she has a very intense connection to this theological heritage and really wants to think through and tease out the implications of these things and think a little bit more about how this particular way of approaching theology is really focused on leaving earth, getting to heaven. Dickinson wants to think about what is the value of earth now. All of these are questions that Christians were asking in the 19th century, ask today. And so I really want to emphasize that we can't say Dickinson rejected her faith totally, but we can say she rejected a particular way of thinking about her faith, namely Calvinism. So this week we read Papa Above, which we just read together, Going to Heaven, You're Right, the Way is Narrow, I Know That He Exists, This World is Not Conclusion, Mine by the Right of the White Election, Afraid of Whom Am I Afraid, The Soul Unto Itself, My Faith is Larger Than the Hills, and Is Heaven a Physician? And if you haven't already read these poems, as you read them, or if you've already read them, go back to them with these questions of predestination, of the relationship between earth and heaven, God and humanity, and also consider these poems in light of our discussion of nature, right? Many of these poems talk about faith in natural terms. My faith is larger than the hills. How can these conversations that we've been having and these themes that we've been exploring inform each other? So that is all that I have for you today. I'm looking forward to being back with you next week when we talk more about Dickinson. And I think next week is death. We'll see what video comes up next, but I'm pretty sure it's death. If it's not death, it's Dickinson and science. But much more to come in the coming weeks. And thanks for watching. Thanks for reading along. Feel free to leave thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in a week.